when I woke up, very confused. She said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive."
I went into the games not knowing what was coming.
As humans, we just hate uncertainty.
You just sensed that it was out there.
You have to start somewhere.
We're all programmed to push ourselves even farther.
This is On the X, an Ironclad original. Welcome to On the X. I'm Chris Irwin, and today my guest is Jocko Willink. I feel like I don't have to say Jocko's last name. I just need to say Jocko, and everyone knows who it is. He's a retired Navy SEAL who led SEAL Team 3's Task Unit Bruiser during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and then transitioned into the business world as the co-founder of Echelon Front, a leadership consulting firm. His best-selling books, Extreme Ownership, A Dichotomy of Leadership, and Discipline Equals Freedom, are staples for many people and organizations these days. Through the Jocko podcast, he continues to offer insights and advice based on his experience in the military and working with leaders. He's kind of into everything: merchandise, publishing, supplements, and kids' books now. And we talk about The Warrior Kid and his new film coming out of the same title, along with other topics. So here we go with Jocko Willink on the X. You're somebody, I was thinking about this, there's so much content out there of yours, of you on other podcasts, of all that kind of thing. So I'm going to do my best here to try to cover some new ground. I'm sure there's going to be some things that are rehashing, but hopefully we can get into some stuff that maybe you haven't talked about 1,000 times in the past, and we'll do our best. So what I wanted to start with was, you're somebody who I think so many people look at and see as like very successful in the military and then extremely successful post-military with what you've done since then. But I wanted to know what your transition was actually like, because it's something that, guys, it's a challenge for a lot of people coming out of the military. What was that actually like for you? Was it something where you never had a doubt, you had a specific goal? Like, what was it? Was it, hey, I want to go help businesses with leadership? Was it, I want to become kind of this public figure where people look up to me in this way? What were the challenges in there? What was that actually like for you?
Well, no, I didn't really plan any of this stuff. I was planning to retire. I was gonna, I have a jiu-jitsu MMA gym in San Diego, and I was just gonna teach jiu-jitsu and hang out with my wife and kids and surf and play guitar. That was kind of my plan.
You play guitar? I didn't know you did that. Do you play?
Yeah. So I
play too.
gonna do that. Yeah, right on. So I was gonna do that, and I was probably about 6 months from retirement, and I have a friend that I knew through jiu-jitsu, and he asked me if I wanted to come, and he owned a big company, and he asked me if I wanted to come and talk to his executive team about leadership. And I said, yeah, sure. He's a friend of mine. So I went and did that. And I talked about, I had been teaching leadership at TradeEt for the past few years, my last few years of my career. And so I had dialed in a lot of leadership principles. And so I talked about those leadership principles with his executive team. And when I got done, he came up to me and said, I want you to come and talk to every division I have. And I was like, well, I'm going to retire. And he said, I'll pay you. And I said, all right, well, let's see what this looks like. And so I ended up traveling around to a bunch of his divisions around the country. And at one of those divisional meetings, the CEO of the parent company was there. And when I got done, he came up to me and said, hey, I want you to come and talk to all my CEOs. And he owned like 45 or 50 companies at the time. And I went to a CEO summit that he put together, and I talked to all those CEOs. And when I got done, a bunch of them came up to me and said, come and talk to my company, come and talk to my company, come and talk to my company. And so then I kind of had a business, I guess you could say. So I started going around and talking to all these different companies, and I actually talked to Leif Babin, who I worked with in the SEAL teams. And I was like, hey man, I need some support over here. And he was like, yeah, let's do it. And so we started, traveling around, and eventually there was a really high demand signal to write, do you have any pamphlets you can give us? Do you have this stuff written down anywhere? So we ended up writing down the principles in a more concrete manner. And I think it was one of Leif's wife's friends was a literary agent. And eventually one of those literary agents was like, this is a book. And so we ended up writing a book called Extreme Ownership. That did, and before that came out, a team guy friend of a team guy friend was like, hey, had told Tim Ferriss, who is a
Yeah.
author and a podcast guy, and said, hey, you should have this guy Jocko on your podcast.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going on Tim Ferriss's podcast. It was the first interview of any kind that I did. That was actually before the book came out. And Tim Ferriss's huge podcast, and it kind of like did really well. And so the book came out, the book did really well, and then a couple weeks later, a guy named Joe Rogan heard Tim Ferriss podcast, and he said, hey, you should come on my podcast. And both Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan, they told me, hey, you should start your own podcast. And so I had the two biggest podcasters in the world tell me to start my own podcast. So I was like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And this was in 2015, actually. So podcasting wasn't really a thing like it is now.
Yeah.
And there wasn't really a lot of them. And so I started my podcast, and it kind of just came out and did well. And then I just kind of went from there. So that's sort of in a nutshell how I went from hopefully planning to retire and surf and do jujitsu to doing all the crap that I'm doing now.
That's wild. So just kind of fell in your lap in a lot of ways.
Yep.
Did you have any doubts along the way with any of that? Was there a portion where you're like, oh, I don't know about this? Or was it always like when it kind of went along, was it like, yep, this is great. Next thing.
I never really gamble what I can't afford to lose. So it wasn't like I was putting some huge amount of money at risk or anything like that. I thought when the book came out, I didn't know, no one really knows if something's going to be a popular book. So, we wrote the book. I figured worst case scenario, I could give it away to a bunch of people and they could hopefully learn some lessons from it. But I did see that when I started working with civilian companies, that the leadership principles that I had from the teams were really, really effective. And so I kind of did know that, and it was literally the first question I got asked, that when I answered that question, I realized that everything that I knew about leadership from the SEAL teams applied to every leadership endeavor.
Yeah.
And I kind of knew that, and I felt very confident about it. And the more I worked with companies, the more confident I felt. And so I just thought, we're just going to continue to spread the word and help people learn how to lead.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't any, I wasn't, taking some big risk or anything like that. I was just kind of teaching what I had been teaching. I knew it was effective. I knew it worked in combat. I knew it worked in business. So it wasn't, I didn't have any kind of crazy insecurities, and I never had any, I never, I didn't want to be an author. I didn't want to be a podcaster. I wasn't like judging myself on how good my book did or who listened to the podcast. I didn't really care about any of that. So I just was doing what I was doing. And so I guess there wasn't any excessive pressure that, I had on myself.
Are there any components to military leadership that you think don't apply in the civilian world? Has there been anything you've come across where you're like, you know what, actually that's different when it's applied to the civilian workforce?
No, the stereotypical things that people think military leadership is, and in some cases they're right, because there are, as tyrannical leaders in the military and authoritarian leaders in the military that are horrible and no one likes to work for them, and they do a bad job. And it's the same thing in the civilian sector. There are tyrannical leaders in the civilian sector. There's authoritarian leaders in the civilian sectors, and no one likes to work for them, and they're terrible. So it's the same. The principles are the same. And now we work with companies all over the world, and they're cross-cultural, and they apply in the military. I mean, it's real obvious. Like, hey, do you think we should not work together as a team? Like, there's no one in the military or in the civilian sector that doesn't think we should work together as a team. Is there anyone that thinks, hey, maybe we should make our plans and our communication so complicated that no one understands them? Nope, no one says that. No one says, hey, we should work on all of our priorities at the same time so that we're spread too thin and we can't actually get anything done. No one says that. No one says, hey, it's a really good idea to control everything through one conduit of leadership and have that one person make all the decisions. Let's use centralized command. No one says that. And no one says, hey, when you make a mistake, what you should do is blame other people.
Right.
So it's like these principles they're universal. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't people that violate these principles, both in the military and in the civilian world. Of course there are. There's horrible cases of that. and it happens. But we try and teach the things that work that will help people improve their organization and help themselves be better and lead a better team.
Yeah. What are those consistent themes that seem to come up over and over again for you specifically? Are there consistent themes where it's like when you're going into companies, you tend to see the same kind of mistakes being made by the leaders in those companies?
Yeah. So first of all, the principles of combat leadership that we talk about: cover, move, simple, prioritize, and execute, and decentralized command. These are the different companies will be good at maybe one of those and not so good at one of the other ones. And it's the same thing with a SEAL platoon. Like some SEAL platoons are really good at cover and move, but no one understands the plan. So it falls apart because their plan is too complicated. And the same thing can happen in a company. Oh, the company works well together, but no one understands what the strategy is, so they fall apart. Or, hey, they know what their priorities are, but one person is trying to do everything themselves. So they're not using decentralized command. So it's a problem. So the same things that you would have in a SEAL platoon, the same problems you could have in a SEAL platoon are the same problems that you can have in a civilian company. And then of course the root of all problem being the lack of ability to take ownership and the ego getting involved, where we're just going to blame other people when things go wrong, which is, it definitely is a theme. And if you pull the string on many problems, often it's just an ego problem at the end of the day.
Yeah. Do you feel like that's so I had the episode that came out yesterday, and obviously this won't butt up right against it in terms of the timing of releasing the episodes, but was with Simon Sinek, and I asked him, with his experience with leaders and companies, if there were characteristics that he thought leaders need, like what were the like core characteristics that he thought leaders needed to have. And his two were courage and integrity, which were kind of inextricably linked as well. Do you have something like that? And the thing we talked about on there too is that I feel like that is getting disincentivized these days. Like you mentioned, the sort of lack of accountability. Go ahead.
Yeah, when people ask me about the characteristic that I think is most important for leadership, it's a real simple answer for me to give. For me, it's humility. So, and the reason that I give that answer is because when I was running Trade Ed for the last few years, I was in the SEAL teams. When we would fire a SEAL leader, when we'd fire someone from a platoon commander or a platoon chief from a leadership position, we would be firing that SEAL leader not because they didn't know how to shoot their weapon, not because they weren't in good physical condition, not because they didn't understand strategy. Those guys would get fired from those leadership positions because they lacked humility. Because when they lack humility, they don't listen to anyone else. They try and impose their plan on everyone. They don't take any input, and they don't take any feedback. They don't take any criticism. And so it's just terrible. And not to mention when someone like that gets overseas, now they don't respect the enemy because they don't think the enemy is as good as they are, and now they get complacent. So it's just problematic. So that's always the thing that I talk about when it comes to the characters. The most important characteristic of a leader is humility.
Yeah, I'm completely in agreement with you on this, and I wanted to bring this up later, but let's talk about it now. And we'll get into this too, but your kids stuff, like your kids books here, which I read through, and this first one, there's a portion of it where you're sort of bringing up the different codes from Viking code and like knighthood and the Ranger Creed and right, all of that kind of stuff. And what's interesting about them is not all of them have that in there. In fact, it's only really like when I looked at it, like the SEAL ethos, and then when this kid comes up with his own code right at the end, it's got in there, be humble. And I think that that's so critical. And I'm curious why, just your thoughts on that too, like why you think it isn't in some of those. Not to say that they're wrong, but why that's not in there. And again, getting back to kind of the previous question here, do you feel like we're sort of going in the wrong direction in that regard with leaders these days? Because I see that a lot, I think, in the public landscape, like it's being disincentivized to act that way. It's almost incentivized to not have integrity and not have courage and almost, to your point, blame everybody else. Do you think that's true?
I don't know if I necessarily see that. I know that people will tag me in social media when a leader either takes ownership or doesn't take ownership. And, they'll tag me and say, this is extreme ownership. Great job, this individual. Maybe it's a sports team coach or it's a leader of some kind of business. And so I'll see people will mention when that happens, and then they'll mention when someone doesn't take ownership and blames other people, they'll kind of mention that as well. So I see a little bit of both, but I don't think it's any kind of, I think that's probably been like that for a long time, that people's natural instincts. And a lot of what we teach is to counter the natural human instincts that we have. In fact, just about everything that we teach is to counter the natural instincts that most people have. And, for instance, cover and move. Why do we need to teach cover and move? Well, it's because our natural instinct is to look out for ourselves and not,
Yeah.
take care of the rest of the team. Why do we have to teach simple? Well, it's because people have a tendency to make things too complicated. Why do we have to teach prioritize and execute? Well, it's because people have a tendency to try to do too many things at the same time or to focus on the wrong things. Why do we have to teach decentralized command? Well, it's because most people want to control everything and make every decision. And why do we have to teach extreme ownership? Well, it's because most people want to blame other people. It's their natural instinct. When you walk into the kitchen and your 5-year-old kid is sitting there at the table and there's milk spilled and you ask him what happened, he points in the milk and says the milk spilled. He didn't do it. That's a natural instinct, is to blame the milk, an inanimate object. So I think that these different types of leaders, good leaders and bad leaders, have been around for a long time. And I think that maybe they get highlighted more or less in certain time periods, but I think I think there's lots of incentive to take ownership, and I see it a lot with a lot of leaders right now.
Yeah. Is there anything you do when you go in with companies that's focused on the team itself too? I sort of asked this question to Simon as well. Like, do we sometimes put too much emphasis just on the leader and not on the group?
Well, I think the key component for me is one of the things when we talk about decentralized command, we talk about everyone as a leader. Literally everyone is a leader. And you know this from being in a SEAL platoon. In a SEAL platoon, in a good SEAL platoon, everyone's a leader. And every fire team leader is going to step up and make things happen. And a new guy that's in his first platoon, he's going to step up and lead in his little part of the mission and make things happen. And that's what we should want. And so, yeah, for me, everyone is a leader. So therefore, everyone needs to learn the leadership skills and the leadership principles.
Yeah. Do you ever talk about, I'm sure you do, but I'm curious what it looks like for you, like leading up, right? Because I think so often we think about leading down, where it's like, I'm in charge of people and therefore I am the leader and I'm leading them. But there's not as much talk about how you lead up the chain of command. So how do you approach that with companies?
Yeah, we actually have a chapter in the book that's called Leading Up the Chain of
There you
Command.
go. Yeah.
Specifically what we talk about. And that's again, this, you're in the military. I and you, as leaders of a SEAL platoon, also had to lead our commanding officer in the right direction. We had to lead our commodore. We had to lead our task group commander. We had to lead a battalion commander. And again, it's leadership. So you're interacting. I say all the time, if you have to interact with other human beings, or when you interact with other human beings, it's leadership. And I'd say this as well. The way that I lead up the chain of command is the same way that I lead across the chain of command and down the chain of command. So if I build a relationship with people, whether they're the lowest person in the platoon or they're the senior SOTIF commander, I am going to treat them all the same. I'm going to listen to what they have to say. I'm going to try and implement what they're talking about into the plan. I'm going to treat them with respect. I'm going to make sure they know I care about them. And that's what I'm going to do, up, down, and across the chain of command. So I think, yeah, leading up the chain of command is a critical part that doesn't get talked about very often. That's one of the reasons why we wrote about it.
Yeah, yeah. What's been the most challenging thing for you in all of this as a civilian doing this? What is the most challenging thing you deal with right now, and what's been the most challenging thing for you kind of personally in that journey?
I probably just don't quite have enough time. There's always more things I want to do, and so just running out of time is probably the main thing. It's when you like doing a lot of different things, you have to prioritize which one of those things are going to get done. And so, I wish I had a few more days in every week, a few more hours in every day.
Yeah. So to that point, obviously one of your oft quoted things is discipline equals freedom. And I'm curious from your perspective, where is the line, or is there a line, I guess, maybe to start there, between discipline and sort of asceticism, right? Like, where does it go from working hard to attain the things you want to get out of life to just kicking yourself in the ass for its own sake every day? Because sometimes I feel like people, they can cross that line where it's like they're so into suffering that suffering becomes their existence, and there's never the reward from the work. Like, at some point there should be a reward, right? Like, it should pay off to make your life better, I would think, at some point.
Yeah, and this whole concept is why we ended up writing the book, The Dichotomy of Leadership.
Yeah.
Because you have to be balanced as a human being, and if you take any characteristic to an extreme, it can become a negative. So, whatever the most positive characteristic that you can think of that a human can have, like generosity. Well, is it possible to be too generous? Yes, it is. And there's people that are out there that are too generous and they get taken advantage of. Even the what I talked about of humility, is it possible to be too humble? Well, yeah. And now you're not standing up for yourself. Again, maybe you're getting taken advantage of. So if you take any characteristic of a human being and you take it to an extreme, it can absolutely become a negative. And that's obviously true with discipline too. If you are making yourself miserable, then it doesn't seem like that's very beneficial. I was at a birthday party for a friend's kid, and the grandmother was there, and I was they chopped up the ice cream cake. I took a big old slab of ice cream cake, and the grandma had heard of me or whatever, and she came over and she said, "I thought discipline equals freedom." And I said, "Yes, ma'am. This is the freedom part." Yeah, you gotta be balanced.
That's good though. I mean, do you think sometimes it's funny? So at the beginning of the dichotomy of leadership, there's a portion there where you're saying basically that the title of the first book, having the word extreme, was problematic for you. And do you think that that's misunderstood still from people, where they take that extreme to mean extreme in all cases? Is that something where, if you could wind it back, you would change that wording in some way, or would you approach that differently?
I don't know if I could. I don't really think too much about if I can go in the past and change something that
fair enough.
happened. But yeah, it's kind of a funny story, right? We put the term extreme ownership in the title, and people think that means be extreme, which is literally why we wrote The Dichotomy of Leadership, because you can't and you should not be extreme in things. It's very, very seldom is it beneficial to be extreme in some aspect. So yes, some people took that the wrong way. And even with the idea of ownership, is it possible to take too much ownership? Yes, it is. Because if you work for me, Chris, and I say, "Okay, Chris, here's what we're doing. Here's the mission. Here's the people I want you to take with you. Here's the weapons I want you to use. Here's the approach I want you to take to the target. Here's how I want you to hit the target. Here's what I want you to do with the people we capture. Here's the route I want you to take back here. And here's what time I want you to be in the debriefing room. Take ownership of that and make it happen." Well, I haven't given you any ownership at all.
Right.
So that's problematic. So anything taken to the extreme can become negative without question.
Yeah. On the X is proudly presented by Mechanics Wear. Known for their durability and comfort, Mechanics Wear gloves are made from top quality materials, offering protection against impacts, cuts, and abrasions. They feature advanced breathability and moisture wicking technology to keep hands cool and dry during any task. Designed with precision, these gloves provide a secure grip and flexibility, helping users work more efficiently and safely. They've certainly been my personal go-to glove for decades. Mechanics Wear gloves are available at most retailers, on mechanicswear.com, and on GSA Advantage. Why do you think so many veterans these days struggle from a mental health perspective? I kind of want to get your cut on this, because I think about, teammates, all of us out there who know for the most part, these principles, right? And know how to be disciplined and know how to get up early and work hard and do all of that. So what other tools, I guess, are we potentially lacking that we need in that fight or in that struggle?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think we need to understand the fact that most veterans are not struggling. Most veterans are, I mean, I work with so many different companies, and, every company I work with, who here's a veteran? And there's a crowd of between 100 and 3,000 people, and they're all working people that are out there doing jobs. And whether they're out on the oil fields or in finance, a bunch of people raise their hands and they're out there doing great in the world. So I think it's important to understand that and it's the same thing after Vietnam. Sure, we get the stereotypical Vietnam vet that, was a little messed up after the war, but most Vietnam vets came home and carried on with their lives. Korea, same thing. World War II, that's what happens. So most veterans are not, most veterans carry on, and they carry on. So some veterans get a little bit, they get a little bit bogged down. And when I talk to veterans that are going through that, I think it's very important that you find a new mission, because
Yeah, I'm with you on this.
When you're in the military and you've got your friends and you've got a mission, and even, on a big scale, you've got this really powerful mission of protecting democracy and freedom and our way of life in the world. What an incredible mission, and what a powerful and honorable thing to do. And then, as you know, day to day, you've got a mission. Like, we're going to go diving today. We're going to hit this target. We're going to prepare. We're going to train. Like, we've got things that we're going to do every day. We have taskings and we have purpose. Every day we have small tasks that lead to this overarching broad mission that is a honorable thing. And what a great way to live your life. I mean, it was, as you know, it's a great way to live your life. Best job ever. And when you get out, all of a sudden, all that is gone. The mission is gone, the day-to-day tasks are gone, and all the friends are gone. So that can be a problem. And I think when you ask me about, veterans that are struggling, I think it's because that's hard. And you have to find a new mission. What are you going to do now? And I think if the devil's idle hands are the devil's plaything, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I think a lot of that happens with veterans. They get out, nothing really to focus on. They don't really know where they're going, and then that's where things, I believe, can start to spiral a little bit.
Yeah. I'm totally with you on the kind of purpose. Finding purpose is so important. And for me, the other piece is community, that I just think is so critical. Again, you just said it, right? Like the things that you lose, it's like, find those again. So flip that around. And this must come up with companies, but I was talking to a company yesterday, actually, who they were asking me, like, what can we do better to support veterans, like to hire veterans, for the veterans that are in our company, like for a big company, right, that's got like hundreds, thousands of employees. What would you say to that?
You gotta reach out to the organizations, find people that are interested in coming to work for you, and then have a good onboarding process. I think that's one of the, just like in the military, look at the indoctrination that we go through to get into our job, to get screened for our job, to show up for our job, to learn our job. We get a really good, solid indoctrination, and that's not the best word for it, really militant, but how we onboarding people is what they would say in the civilian sector. So set your military folks up so that they get a good onboarding. They understand what the mission is. They understand who to talk to about things, how the chain of command works, who their support people are in various departments, and get them to understand what role they're going to play. And then we can end up in a good spot. And for the veterans, the veterans have to think, hey, I'm a new guy again.
Yeah.
And I'm going to work for this company. And I have 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, 16 years, 20 years, 24 years in a job. And I definitely got some skills from that job, but this is a new job that I don't know. So I need to be humble and
there you go. Yep.
Get ready to learn.
Yeah. It goes back to the humility thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It's really hard sometimes for someone to, be in charge of, they're a platoon sergeant or they're a company first sergeant, or they're a platoon commander, or a company commander, and they're in charge of a life and death, hundreds of people, very stressful situations. And now they come back and they get put in a role where they're getting told, well, actually, you need to check with me before you do that. Or, hey, that's not how we do it here. And instead of saying, okay, well, how do we do it here? Please teach me. Instead, they say, that's stupid.
Yeah.
You know, and so we have to, when we get out of the military, we have to make sure that we stay humble and get ready to be a new guy again.
Yeah.
As much as it can be hard.
Yeah, totally. I'm with you on that. It's funny when I talk to guys too that are getting out, I'll be like, hey, what are you doing next? And they'll be like, yeah, I don't know. And I'm like, good, that's fine. It's okay if you don't know. You don't have to know. And you might find yourself in a position where it's not a good fit too. And that's okay. I landed myself in a terrible position after the military and got fired basically, and I had to eat crow on that, like really be humble about that of like, this was not a good fit. I didn't do a good job. And, but that's okay. I can find purpose, find it somewhere else. It's not the end of the world, but it's tough. It's tough to go from that, like being like, this sort of what you think is just kick ass, like awesome at everything type of thing to being like, well, that didn't work,
Yeah. I think too, the civilian sector is not going to roll out the red carpet for you because you're a veteran.
Yeah.
And do I think they should? Yes. 100%. Like, I think that veterans should get the best treatment in the world. Is that going to happen? Nope, it's not. Civilian companies in the private sector, they need to make money. That's what they need to do. And so when they bring someone on board, if that person doesn't produce the way they need to produce, that veteran leniency only lasts so long. And eventually you've got to be able to fulfill that role and do that job. Otherwise, you're just a token veteran, and eventually the token veteran isn't going to be there anymore because it costs money. So I really just making sure, and listen, like I said, I work with companies all the time. There's veterans that are up, down, and across the chain of command in every company I work with, in every industry that you can imagine. There's Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. In every company that I speak to, there's veterans, and they're doing great. And the reason that they do great is they show up, they're humble, they get after it, they work hard, and they end up eventually utilizing the skills that they did get from the military, and they combine those with the skills that they learn by being humble at the job, and they end up doing a phenomenal job and doing great inside the private sector. So that's what we got to do.
Yeah.
Stay humble. Don't expect the red carpet to get rolled out.
I completely agree with you on that. So
go ahead. One more thing. Since you kind of asked me something about this earlier, sometimes also the way you did it in the military was not good. And so, we all worked for tyrannical leaders at some point in our career. Some of us may have even been tyrannical leaders in our career. And you can get away with that in the military. And I can tell you why you can get away with it in the military, because you're in a leadership position for 2 years in the military. And as you know, in a SEAL platoon, for example, but it's the same in an Army company or an Army platoon or Marine Corps company or Marine Corps platoon, that officer or that platoon chief is going to be in that role for 2 years. And so we show up in the platoon, and it takes us a few months just to figure out if this guy's cool or not. By the time we start saying, wait a second, he doesn't seem cool. Now it's been 6 months, and and now we go, you know what, this guy is definitely bad. Now it's been 9 months. Hey, we should start like trying to get rid of this guy. That's our leader. Well, that's going to be a problem. And then another 4 months goes by, and now it's like, well, we're going on deployment. We might as well just suck it up. We do a good job because we do a good job in spite of the leader. And now the leader, we come back from deployment. What does that leader get? He gets a good evaluation, and he gets promoted. And so that leader, who is a terrible leader, still gets promoted because the boys did their job. And so if you get out of the military and you think, well, I used to just bark at my guys and they would do what I told them to do, and I can't believe these civilians are so weak. No, it's actually you were a bad leader in the military, and now you're a bad leader in the civilian sector. So thinking that the way that you did things in the military were good because you got promoted a couple times, you just might need to reassess that. You know, I did a bunch of podcasts about a book called the it's about the military psychology
Huh.
and how bad leaders, first of all, are drawn to the military, and second of all, how they can sometimes excel in the military. The military attracts tyrannical leaders because when they look at the military from the outside, they go, wait a second, if I go into that group of people, people will have to listen to me. The book is called The Psychology of Military Incompetence. And so some people, they love being in charge. They love, demanding respect, and they see the military and they go, that's where I'm going. And when they get there, they love the discipline of it. They love the orderliness of it. They love being able to tell people what to do and getting treated with respect. And they can actually do well, especially in a garrison environment. They can do well in a garrison environment where they control everything.
Mm-hmm.
But these are the type of leaders that are very bad in combat, because as we know, in combat, the enemy gets a vote and things aren't going to go the way you expected them to go. And the team isn't going to do what you expected them to do. And these people are terrible leaders in combat. So there is the tendency for a authoritarian person to get attracted to the military is pretty strong, and they can actually be successful because they don't get tested the right way, and you're in leadership positions for very short periods of time, and so they can kind of get away with it, and that's the way it works.
Yeah.
But please do not take that attitude into the civilian sector and then get mad at civilians because they think, man, why are you yelling at people?
Yes.
So just wanted to throw that out.
I think that's exactly right. And that's kind of what I was getting at, because I reflect on my own experience kind of transitioning into the civilian, and it has nothing to do with principles or overall leadership concepts or any of that stuff. But there was a style component to it that I had to adjust to that exact point, where after that first job that didn't work out, I spent about 5 years as the president of a startup, and it's a small group. It was very much like a small unit in the military, right? But I had an abrasiveness to me that didn't work in that setting. I was leading a sales team. At one point got up to like 40 people or whatever. And there were times in it, and actually the CEO of the company was a former team guy as well, who had been out longer and had been doing this and had to kind of pull me aside and be like, you got to tone that down a little bit, dude. you got to chill out, and it was that learning experience of, it's not that there was never a time for it, but it was, you got to know your audience and like work in the context of like figure out, how you get the message across without always using the same tool of kind of aggression and that piece of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and when I was in the military, I never used that tool. I never yelled at anybody. I never yelled at anybody that worked for me. Yeah, well, just always tried to listen to what they had to say. I had a platoon commander. I was very lucky. I had a platoon commander when I was in my second platoon, who was a prior enlisted guy. He's a legendary guy. You know who he is, but I won't say his name. But he had come up through the ranks of the SEAL teams up to senior chief before he became an ensign, and then was my platoon commander. And just everyone loved him. Best leader ever. Never yelled at anyone. Always tactically brilliant. Smart as a whip, and just a great guy. And I was very lucky because I saw that and that was in my second platoon. And in that platoon, we had actually had a mutiny against the original platoon commander, who was arrogant and abrasive and authoritarian. And we had a mutiny against him and got him fired. And so I saw the difference, and I understood, and I was very lucky because I was young and stupid. But in seeing the contrast between a tyrannical, authoritarian, loudmouth, arrogant guy who wasn't very experienced and was very insecure about that, and then working for a guy who was eminently qualified, eminently experienced, incredibly humble, and really listened to us and empowered us. It was just a great experience, and I took that and kind of ran with that for the rest of my career, and I always tried to emulate that particular guy. So I got very lucky. I think, I'm sure you experienced this where you'd meet a guy in the SEAL teams, the way he would lead, you'd say, "Hey, who is your first platoon chief?"
Mm.
And they tell you who's oh yeah, okay, I see that. Or you'd meet a great guy and you go, "Hey, who's your first platoon chief?" And you go, "Oh, okay, yeah, I know that guy." So it's just one of those things. I think you learn a little bit. You learn and model some of the behavior that you see when you're younger. And if you don't know any better, it can be hard to, do some corrective measures on it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I'm not saying like I'm not talking about it's not like I was yelling at everybody or anything like that, but there was just it took me a while to realize that I was a little wound tight, if for lack of a better term, where it was like there was just a tightness to that. And it was also there was just a way that I was used to interacting with people where, you kind of give each other shit and you can kind of, you can poke at people and it's just part of the culture a little bit where I had to kind of do some self-assessment and be like, yeah, I got to tone some of that down a little bit. It just doesn't work quite as well.
Yeah, well, that lesson I actually learned, as I was a nightmare as a E4, E5 in a SEAL platoon. Of course, I was like every other E4 and E5 in a SEAL platoon. Any weakness that was seen was targeted and assaulted, and we would pick anyone apart. Didn't matter who you were. If you did something wrong, you were going to get crushed. You were going to get called out. And like you said, I mean, that's the fun. That's the banter of the SEAL platoons
Sure.
that we love. Um, I I got picked up for a commissioning program. I ended up becoming an officer, but I had to go to college. And when I was in college, all of a sudden I wasn't around team guys anymore. And so my banter was now directed at this poor woman who I had married, my wife. And after about 3 months, I came home and, I said something to her and she looked at me and she said, "Hey, I'm not a team guy." And I immediately knew she was 100% right. And she did sign up for this kind of behavior. And so I was like, yep. But then, also as I came up through this in the SEAL teams, you know, being an assistant platoon commander, a troop commander, and every step, your word carries more and more weight. And I really had to pull myself back from being the guy that was going to send the zingers out during a brief or something like that. I just had to recognize that that wasn't the appropriate behavior and that my words carried more weight in both directions. Meaning, if I was going to say something positive, it carried a lot of weight, meant a lot. So that's great. But also, if I said something negative, that carried a lot of weight as well. So I had to be more cautious and really more intentional and thoughtful about the things I was going to say to the team.
Yeah. So you're obviously someone, I mean, this has kind of come up a lot in this, who you do a lot of self-analysis, it seems. And you're also someone who's obviously very disciplined. Like you get up early, you have a training regimen, all of that. Do you have some kind of, I don't know, mindfulness practice, meditation, breath work? Is that part of your routine at all that you incorporate into things?
No.
Have you ever felt the need for it?
I think the closest I could come to that. Well, look, I train jujitsu a lot. I
Yeah.
surf, I play guitar. I think those things are all, relatively mindless, if mindless efforts that allow your brain to wander and solve
Yeah,
problems and
sure.
think.
Yep.
So I think that's good. But I also know that that's not truly what meditation is, and I've never really done meditation. But I think for me, I think the closest thing I can if I was to pull the thread on this, which I'm doing for the first time right now, talking to you, I think that the debrief culture that I grew up with since I was a little kid,
Mm-hmm.
and my little kid, I mean an 18-year-old, team guy, I think that the continual debrief and everything that we did as a SEAL platoon eventually trickled into me debriefing what I did unconsciously, usually not consciously, and usually not like, oh, this is what I did, here's the mistake I made, but always thinking like, oh yeah, I can see where I could do that better, or I shouldn't have done that. That was a bad move. I won't do that again. I think that debrief culture is what probably allowed me to make some level of progression as a human. And I think it just comes from being in the SEAL platoons for so long. It's I, really, as you know, man. I mean, being in a SEAL platoon you. It's such an awesome place to be, and that is truly. I always say I was raised like at SEAL Team 1, which is
Mm-hmm.
where I spent my first 8 years. And so you really, that's all the impressionable years for me was at SEAL Team One, like those first 8 years of my career. And just being in a SEAL platoon, and everything is a debrief, and everything is you could do better, and everything is here's the mistakes you made. And I think that just built up in my head over time, and I paid attention to the mistakes that I made and try and fix them.
Yeah. Let's talk about the kid stuff. So what got you into wanting to write where'd that come from? Writing kids books?
I have 4 kids, and I was trying to buy a book for my son. I have girl, girl, boy, girl. And I was trying to buy a book for my son. And I went to the bookstore. This is like Amazon was a thing, but I went to a bookstore anyways, and there was a book and it was like pirates. And I was like, oh, great, cool, pirate book. This will be good. And I just bought it without flipping through it. And I got home and I opened up this pirate book and I started to read it to my son. And these pirates were the weakest, the wimpiest, most lame pirates I could have ever imagined. And I just said to myself, this is ridiculous. So I'm going to write a book where I can convey the values and principles that I know will be helpful, because that's how I was, again, raised in the SEAL teams, was with these principles and values. So that's what it was. And as I was writing that book, I was like, I think it might have been maybe the third or fourth book, but that I wrote. But I remember just writing it and thinking, I can't believe no one's written this book yet. I was super happy that I'm writing this book, because it was fun to write, because I wrote it as if I was a 10-year-old kid.
Yeah,
and so
no,
when
you
I
did. Yeah.
Yeah, when I read it, it feels like someone else wrote it. And I I always catch myself. Someone will say, oh, I read your Warrior Kid book, and I'll say, oh, that's such an awesome book. And I never really say that about books that I wrote for adults. I never say, yeah, it's an awesome book. I never say that. That's arrogant, right? But when someone asks me about Warrior Kid, I'll catch myself going, such an awesome book. Because when I read it, I feel like, man, a 10-year-old kid wrote that, even though it was me. So I don't know what that says about my maturity level, but yeah.
But talk about what you're trying to do with this, and the principles. Like you said, the characters in this pirate book were not anything you would want to teach somebody. And so what's interesting is, so I got this, I ordered this, and I was thinking, sort of like with the pirate book, I was thinking, oh, this is like a 20-page like bedtime story type of thing that you just flip through with like a little kid. And I get it. I'm just like, oh no, this is it's written for kids, but it's a 200-page book. But I read through it. It was great, and it's got the kind of kid character and this uncle character who's kind of based on you, obviously. But yeah, talk about like what you're trying to do with that, the principles that you think need to be instilled in kids.
Yeah, that's it. And kids, so years ago, the SEAL teams were having some problems, right? And a bunch of us went to San Clemente Island and wrote the SEAL ethos. I don't know if you remember when that happened.
I do.
Want to say it was,
yes, I do.
Were you there?
I was not there doing it, but I remember when it happened. Yeah.
So there was like maybe 20 of us, and it was a pretty cool spread of people, a bunch of master chiefs and senior officers and senior chiefs. It was a pretty cool mix of people. Not perfect. But it was like, hey, we need to have some kind of we need to write down the way we should behave, because every other branch has that. Every other branch, and then when you look at it, it's not just every other branch, it's military tradition. And it's not just military tradition, it's I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States.
Yeah.
It is establishing a code of conduct. And it's really difficult for a service member to figure out how they're supposed to behave in situations that they really haven't been taught about, unless they have some kind of a code to live by. And it's obviously the same thing for kids. And listen, we used to have structures in place that would deliver that to kids. Primarily, you could say some of it was taught in the schools, some of it was taught in the Boy Scouts, some of it was taught at church, Some of it was taught in sports teams, but there was definitely a stronger opportunity to have a code introduced to a kid where they say, okay, I know what decision I should be making right now just based on the code I'm supposed to live by. And we really just got away from that for a number of reasons. And I realized that. And so we did that in the SEAL teams. And that code or the SEAL ethos, it was interesting to me because it definitely came across as very top down
Yeah.
because it came from, and that's never a good way for a group to establish an ethos. Uh, but I think over time, and what really hit me was the the first time I went to a memorial service and they read it, and that's when I said to myself, okay, this is this may be getting some traction. This may be getting some traction. So, and I think now it is definitely something that gets referred to in a positive way. Again, not by everyone, because you can't just throw an ethos on people. You can't impose your culture on people. It has to be organic. But I think over time it's become more organic in the SEAL teams. So, kind of with that in my mind, I knew that kids needed a code to live by, and I knew that some of those things just were not being taught anymore. And I wanted to give kids an opportunity to have a framework of values and decision making for their life that would help them in everything that they do.
Yeah.
So that's how I ended up writing the book.
Hey everybody, Chris Irwin here, Communications Director for the Navy SEAL Foundation, the On the X podcast host. So Ironclad is our video production company. They are our podcast production company, and they've been with us since before I was even at the foundation, so more than 6 years. They're pretty much in some way plugged in with just about everything we do at the foundation, certainly on the communications side of things, and I honestly don't know what I would do without them. So they are absolutely top shelf in every regard in what they do. They're able to capture things that really look authentic, especially when it comes to some of the operator footage that can be challenging to do. And everything else is just done at such a high level that I don't really have to think about it or worry about it. If you or your organization or your company are looking for video production, if you're looking for post-production, podcast hosting, these guys can do it all. Check them out, ironcladagency.com, highly recommended. Talk about just the concept of being a warrior, because it's one of my favorite words, and to me it's the highest compliment you can give somebody, quite frankly. I liked it so much that, like, all the little kids soccer teams that I ever coached, we were the Warriors. I was like, we're going to be the Warriors, guys. Like, I mean, any of these other animals, tigers or whatever, like, that's nice and everything, but we're going to kind of stand for something and talk to them about, like, sort of similar, like, why I thought that was important. But I'm curious how you frame that, especially in the context of somebody that's not fighting a war, that's not a combatant, right? Like, what does that mean for, like, everyday people to be a warrior?
Yeah, and that's a word that, quite frankly, I didn't love that word. I thought that word had been very overused. Everyone was a warrior, be a warrior.
Sure.
Like, I thought that, very quickly after September 11th, that word became very overused, and everyone was all of a sudden, warrior this and warrior that. And I think it had lost some of its meaning. And but when I was writing the book, I actually knew that there was no other word that could be used. There's literally no other word that could be used. So the book was Way of the Warrior Kid from the moment the whole idea came into my head, was this is a warrior kid. And so what does it mean to be a warrior? I mean, we are, as warriors, putting the team before ourselves, putting the cause above ourselves. These are the things we are willing to do, things that don't benefit us, but benefit our team, our community, our friends, our country. That's what we're doing. And so that's they're doing the right things for the right reasons, and that's what a warrior is to me.
Yeah. Do you think that that is understood on like a societal level? Sometimes I feel as if the concept gets confused at times and becomes a little bit too much about just sort of kick ass and take names, and not enough about kind of like the selfless service, the give back, even the kind of well-roundedness. Like you talk about playing guitar, like I totally think that that's a component of it too. Like having an artistic outlet, I think, is important for people, right? Do you think that's true? Do you think that sometimes I don't want to say corrupted, but like we've sort of strayed a little bit from what potentially the kind of core concept should be of that?
Yeah, I'll give you a really bifurcated answer here,
Okay.
which is a warrior in my mind. Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the, so there's a movie being
Well, I
made.
was about to ask you about this. Yeah. Yeah.
But one of the key things in the movie is as we talked through it, and Chris Pratt is playing Uncle Jake, and one of the things that we talked a lot about, and that I talked to him a lot about was, hey man, you get off the plane, and like I got off the plane, I'm a dad. I'm gonna be super nice and cool to my kids. I never yelled and screamed at my kids. I've never had an argument with my wife. Like these things. So this idea that like a warrior is the guy that's like yelling and screaming and being an idiot is just not true. For me, it's like being a warrior is able to go home and say like, "Hey kids, let's play pin the tail on the donkey. Like
Yeah.
let's have fun." I had all kinds of fun and still have fun with my wife and kids. So yeah, that's one part of it. Now, the reason I say that this is going to be a bifurcated answer is that there's a dichotomy. Is we can't forget that what a warrior's job is to go to war. And when you go to war, what you do is you kill people and you put yourself and your friends at risk of being killed. And so let's not forget that. That's what that's the that's a, it's a very these two worlds are not mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And to have guys that were badass warriors on the battlefield come home and be awesome dads and awesome contributors to society and have fun and play guitar and surf and do jujitsu and all good. It's all good. And in my mind, that's the way it should be.
Yeah. So how'd the movie come about? And what is it? So is this you mentioned Chris Pratt. Is it like real people? Is it an animated thing? I have no idea of what this looks like.
Yeah. So they call it live action, which is real people.
Okay. Okay.
I've learned a lot about Hollywood in the last year. And so, yes, live action. So it's real people. It's a film. And the way it came about was I've been approached probably a half a dozen times or so with people saying, "Hey, we'd like to make this into a movie." And no one really seemed to. I also didn't know this about Hollywood. Like they'll try and buy anything, they'll try and option anything. Everyone's trying to make a movie all the time, and so you're going to get these offers. And I got a bunch of the, like I said, I got probably a half a dozen of those offers over the years. And finally, a guy named Ben Everard, he's a movie producer, and he had got the book for his two kids. And a couple days later, he went into one of his kids' bedrooms, and the kid was on the floor doing push-ups. He was like,
Oh,
okay.
cool.
And he walked into the other kid's room, and he was on the floor doing sit-ups. He's like, wait, what are you two doing? And both of them gave him the same answer. We want to be warrior kids. And he picked up the book and said, all right, I'm going to find this guy. And sure enough, friend of a friend of a friend, got in touch with me, and he drove down to San Diego, and he came to my gym, and he sat down and kind of explained what he had done, what his history was, and what he thought we could do. And so we started coming up with a plan. We eventually hired a screenwriter to write the screenplay. And again, this was like a moment of humility for me, because he was like, "Oh, we need a screenplay." And I was like, "Cool, I'll write the screenplay." And he says, like, it's not the same as a book. And I'm like, well, I've written a bunch of freaking best-selling books. I know how to write. And I go, and I wrote the kids' book, so obviously I'll be able to write the screenplay. And and he was just like, you know what? We should get someone that does it for a living. And sure enough, I'm like, okay, like that makes sense. And sure enough, it was the right move because a movie is a different thing than a book, and it lands differently, and you have to make adjustments to it. And I wouldn't have known how to make those adjustments because I didn't have the experience. So we hired a screenwriter, a guy named Will Staples. It was right before the Hollywood writer strike. Again, I learned a lot about Hollywood. And he wrote the screenplay. In the meantime, I had been talking with Chris Pratt. So I have a couple other companies. One of them is a supplement company and a nutrition company called Jocko Fuel, and another one is called Origin, which is a clothing company made in America, 100% made in America. So Chris Pratt, he's friends with Jack Carr, and I'm friends with Jack Carr, who's the author of The Terminal List, and
Yeah,
and we work together and blah blah blah. So I had met Chris Pratt one time before. Anyways, Chris Pratt had reached out to me a couple years ago saying, "Hey, listen, I really love what you're doing with American Made. I actually, Jared Taylor just had me using your supplements to get in shape for Terminal List. I love them. I'd love to do something with you." So he and I connected that way, and we had our business people started to work together to figure out fashion some kind of a business agreement. How could we be partner up? Well, meanwhile, I had this script and the script, when I read the script, the script is really good. It was amazing. And my producer, Ben, he's like, you should give it to Chris Pratt. And I'm like, I'm not giving it to Chris Pratt because you can only imagine that every person that,
sure.
says hi to Chris Pratt or any other person in Hollywood hands him a screenplay and says, hey, look at this. And Chris is a really nice guy. He had reached out to me and I just was like, I'm not doing it. Like, I'm just not doing it. We were starting to talk to some other actors or at least explore some other actors that could do it. And what happened was my business people, my business partners that were talking to Chris's business partners, one of my business partners, well, Jocko's making that kids movie. And he's like, oh, what kids movie? Oh, it's Way the Warrior Kid. It's a best-selling book. And he, oh, do they have a script? Yeah. And so my business partners sent the script to Chris's business partners. And they read the script and were like, we got to give this to Pratt. And so they gave it to Pratt. Pratt read the script and he called me. It's like, we got to make this movie. And actually he has a film agent named Julie, who they call her Dr. No, because she says no to everything. And when I met her the first time, she looked at me and she said, I read this script as soon as she said, I read it in one sitting. When I got done reading it, I wiped the tears from my eyes and I called Chris and I said, you better make this movie. And so once we had Chris Pratt on board, we hired a director who's a great guy, a really powerful director named Mick G, and he came on board, and then ended up getting a unbelievable offer from Skydance, who's a huge movie producer run by David Ellison, who's the son of Larry Ellison, and he's made a bunch of incredible movies, including Top Gun Maverick and a bunch of other Mission Impossible. Like, he's just great stuff. And they came in and made an incredible offer. And so we did the deal and we started filming in August and we filmed for 10 weeks. And it's going to be really good.
When does it come out?
We're not exactly sure when it'll come out, but we're hoping to get it out in the spring. So
Okay.
spring of 25, maybe something like, we're all hoping kind of for June. Like it's a summer-ish type movie. So hopefully it'll come out in the spring.
And is it coming out these days movies come out in theaters, they come out on Netflix. Is this an in theaters movie that's coming out? Is it?
We're not exactly sure how it will come out. It's all, like you said, it's a new world right now.
Yeah.
And it was the biggest Hollywood deal since 2020. It was a huge Hollywood deal. So they're going to figure out the best way to distribute it. And actually, so Skydance has a deal with Apple right now. So actually, it's going to be Apple that owns it. So we'll see how they want to release it.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's crazy.
That's really cool. That's a really cool story of how that all came together. I know we got to wrap up, but of all of these things that you've done, is what excites you the most? Like, everything you do, what do you like the most out of all of that? Is there one thing?
Honestly, when a little kid sends me a letter that says I did my first pull-up after reading Waiting for Your Kid, that's pretty awesome. But it's also awesome when I have some, 38-year-old guy that was able to stop drinking because he got on the path of discipline, or a 32-year-old mom who's started a little business and she's taking ownership of her world. So I think for me the most rewarding thing is just being able to help people out, and I think that's where you get the best payback from.
Yeah, 100%. Cool. Well, let's end it there, man. Really appreciate it. Anything else you want to put out to people? And I mean, of all of these things you have going on, is there anything else in the mix that people should be on the lookout for?
No, I think I'm good. I appreciate the Navy SEAL Foundation. I appreciate everything that they do. They've been around for me when I needed them. I lost friends like we all did, and they really went to bat and were able to help out with families. And so I always try and support the Navy SEAL Foundation as much as I can. So appreciate what you all do at the Navy SEAL Foundation.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, bro. Thanks for listening to On the X, the official podcast of the Navy SEAL Foundation and an Ironclad original series sponsored by Mechanicswear. You can learn more about Jocko at echelonfront.com and jocko.com, and the foundation at NavySealFoundation.org. You can also text the word On the X to 60104 to join our text subscriber list. See you next time.